Hello, everyone. Let me first of all thank Judy Kaufman for her careful preparation of the program, and also to Virginia Barrett for the invitation to the Jung Club of Orange County. I'm very honored. I would also like to extend my gratitude to Holly Fincher for bringing us together. Now that you've listened to the story Solar Eclipse, you may ask yourself what to make of it, how to understand this. Let me give you a brief overview of the content of my presentation. There are three main features in Patrick Roth's way of storytelling. I'm going to talk about all three of them. The first feature is the emotional impact. For us readers or listeners, it is as if we were there on the scene, in the movie, so to speak. Everything is very immediate. We are always close to the action, close to the characters. This has to do with the narrator. He pulls us in. In the second part of my lecture, I will shed some light on the function of the narrator. I think his role has something or even a lot in common with the function of a psychotherapist. The other central feature of Patrick Roth's way of storytelling is his continuous referring to the archetypal background. I'm sure you noticed this while you were listening. Underneath the everydayness of this Starlight Terrace world, this our worldly layer, so to speak, there is a second, somehow mythical or archetypal layer. As you also may have realized, solar eclipse is a very densely woven fabric of images and illusions. I find it interesting to dissect this dense fabric and will draw out some of the various threads of reference. I think the main issue around which most of the themes and motives center is the problem of the anima. I will point this out in the third part of my lecture. The third feature I will be discussing is individuation. I have observed that the plot of Patrick Roth's stories follows the structure of the individuation process. Another term of Jungian psychology with which you are all familiar with. In Edward Edinger's book on Greek myths, he defines the term individuation in a nutshell. Quote, individuation and the growth of consciousness are really the same thing, unquote. Solar eclipse presents the drama of an individuation. That is, everything revolves around the transformation of the hero. It is triggered by an encounter with the dark god. It is to this kind of an experience that changes all and that eclipse all others that the story Solar Eclipse alludes to, that the story title Solar Eclipse alludes to. I will explain this in the fourth part of my lecture. You've just listened to my brief overview. I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, but I won't use it. I think it's distracting most PowerPoint presentations are, in my mind. If you are interested in the quotes I'm referring to from time to time, interested in a citation of the sources, I can furnish them for you. Simply email me. The same goes for further questions or comments. Just email me. I think I'm not sure, but maybe we should have my email address up during the break. Okay, so the first part of my lecture will last 60 minutes. The second part will last 50 minutes. This means that we will finish a little earlier and we will have enough time for Q&A. Now you can just lean back and listen. I'll start with some general remarks about the composition of Starlight Terrace, and then I proceed to the analyzing the figure of the narrator. So first part, structure of the story, and then figure of the narrator. Solar Eclipse is the second story in a 4-part narrative cycle entitled Starlight Terrace. This is also the name of the apartment complex arranged around a swimming pool somewhere in Los Angeles, where the 4 protagonists and the narrator live. The book Starlight Terrace was first published in German in 2004, and the English translation came out in 2012. The book is about 4 stories. One could also say about 4 individuations of people in or beyond midlife, whose thoughts, feelings, and actions are influenced to a high degree by movies and the movie industry. Projections, especially on movie stars and movies, play a correspondingly large role in the psyche of these people. The 5th figure in this quaternio of 4 is the narrator himself. He remains nameless, but we can infer from his comments that he is a German writer who has lived in Los Angeles for a long time. Behind the narrator is, of course, the author, Patrick Roth, his life story and his personal experiences with the city of movies and the movie milieu. In this book, he conveys to us the stories and experiences he collected in conversations with the 4 residents of Starlight Terrace, Rex, Mars, Gary, and June, before shaping them into 4 narratives. Thus, in Starlight Terrace, we are dealing with literary fiction that relies heavily on biographical and autobiographical facts. In a recent interview I did with Patrick Roth, I asked him how real his characters are. My question was, quote, "The world you create in your book, Starlight Terrace, seems tremendously authentic. The protagonists appear to be cut from life. Did you find people like that in Los Angeles?" He answered in a long, very interesting statement. I quote, Patrick, "Oh yes, I was especially fascinated by the so-called inconspicuous people on the fringes of Hollywood, the employees or freelancers in the film industry. You can across them by chance, at a wedding, a party, in coffee shops, or you find out that your neighbor used to work in film for decades. The stars, on the other hand, whom I had to interview so often as a film journalist, were mostly boring. They always had their stories down pat. You couldn't explore unknown spaces with them. But the unimposing bit player who had once moved to LA to make it big here as an actor, screenwriter, director, always had something to tell. They came with high hopes, just wanted to be close to the fire. There's definitely a parallel to that saying of Jesus in the Gospel of Thomas, "He who near me is near the fire." And indeed, one senses that their ardent hopes sometimes have a religious quality, that, albeit unconsciously, a religious dimension is being touched here. Interestingly, my conversations with people who often arrive at a certain point, would often arrive at a certain point, a memory of the moment when their hopes were shattered. And listening, you experienced this crushing event in their retelling. It is as if it were happening to them again. And that moment, you see the depth of truth in that person. There is no pretension left. Everything bursts away, falls away. And this highly human core that suddenly becomes visible, you will love it immediately. And if you, as a listener, have received it correctly, then perhaps it dawns on the other that his or her experience, the lived one and the real-lived one, has not been in vain. Just the opposite, that it has a tremendous value. They see it in you, in the way you react to this moment on their story. Because in that one moment of recognition, if it is consciously captured just once, this is the function of the one who listens intently, there is a transforming power. That was the decisive aspect for me in such conversations, the valuable thing. Unquote. Well, I think here you have a key to understand the Starlight Terrace tales. The stories of Starlight Terrace can be read individually and on their own. But at the same time, they form a cycle as 4 separate parts. That is, they are connected by a common theme and a continuous development, which reaches its climax in the 4th story, entitled "The Woman in the Sea of Stars." It is interesting to follow the unfolding of certain themes and associated motives through the book in their stages as they coalesce towards a center of meaning that emerges gradually. Externally, the cycle is held together by the unity of place, time, and action, which gives it the feel of a classical Greek drama in 4 acts. The stories take place in Starlight Terrace over the course of a year, from June 2002 to June 2003. The 4 characters are thus inhabitants of the same cosmos. The figure of the narrator, who appears in every story and functions as a superior 5th character, also forms a constant factor. Like a medieval chronicler, this narrator initially takes a back seat to his characters in order to let them have their say and to make himself as invisible as possible. And yet, as the secret director, he holds the reins of the entire drama in his hands. We only see the Starlight Terrace world through his subjective glasses. If one wanted to describe the function of the narrator, one would have to call him an eager collector of life shards, which he assembles into 4 individuation stories. As a writer, he gives form, order, and direction to the experiences of his protagonists, which have fragmented into 1,000 images and stories. This is why the role of the narrator for the 4 residents of Starlight Terrace can hardly be underestimated. It is through the narrator's seeing and understanding, through his sympathy and empathy, that the heroes, dissociated as they are, experience meaning in life and glimpse something of the myth they unconsciously live. What is distinctive and remarkable about the 4 stories is how the narrator succeeds in revealing the archetypal psyche emerging behind the singular individual fate, which gives these so-called ordinary people a dignity they have long lost ever since in everyday life. The narrator in Starlight Terrace acts on the one hand as a neutral and objective reporter, but on the other hand, he intervenes in the narrated world at decisive moments. At these junctures of interaction, it becomes particularly clear that the narrator is mirrored in his characters, or rather that the protagonists represent portions of his own personality. In Starlight Terrace, the outer and inner worlds, consciousness and unconscious, are not isolated areas standing side by side. Instead, they intertwine incessantly, forming the famous two sides of a coin. One might also describe it this way. Behind the outer concrete reality, there is hidden a secret inner world, which lies within the narrator. This inner psychic symbolic realm of the collective unconscious finds expression primarily in dreams, which are woven into the plot from time to time. These are predominantly the dreams of the narrator, in which the Starlight Terrace inhabitants appear, precisely as personified aspects of his psyche. In Solar Eclipse 2, a meaningful dream is inserted immediately before the long conversation between the narrator and the character of Moss. In it, the narrator's ego, accompanied by an unknown woman, stands at the bedroom window at night and watches as Moss tries to cross the street, which has been transformed into a raging river. A short time later, Moss clings to the door wing of a car and is swept away by the current. He slips out of sight. Moss represents, it becomes evident here, a shadow aspect of the narrator. It seems as if such neglected, unlived, inferior content is seen and felt in the writing. It also seems as if this very fact helps the narrator's consciousness to understand the sufferings of the shadow and the problems of the anima on a depth level. Okay, so this was my analysis of the narrator and his function. And now I come to my second chapter entitled Recollection. Solar eclipse revolves around the anima problem of modern man. For this reason alone, it makes sense to read the story from a depth psychological angle, as a literary case history, if you will. So let's first take a look at the facts. The hero, Moss McCloud, lives like an old bachelor in a run-down one-room apartment in Starlight Terrace. In the early 1960s, he was an actor in New York and later a casting agent in Los Angeles. He met his wife, Stella, while auditioning for a theater role. From his marriage with her, he has a daughter, Amy. Since the divorce, which took place some 40 years ago, Moss has lost contact with his wife and daughter. His despair and longing for the feminine are accordingly great. Right at the beginning of the story, we encounter the archetypal motive of the lost daughter. At the crack of dawn, Moss asks the narrator to look for his daughter in the street fronting the Starlight Terrace apartment complex. Moss does so in the belief that Amy has rung his doorbell. But the narrator can't find her anywhere. The archetype of this situation comes from the Demeter or Persephone myth. You remember, Hades had fallen madly in love with Kore, which is ancient Greek for girl, a daughter of Zeus and Demeter. Zeus allowed it, and so one day, Hades, god of the underworld, ascended and abducted the young girl as she was picking flowers in a meadow. With his team of horses, he swept her off to his underworldly realm, where the sun never shines. Up on earth, however, the despairing mother wandered around searching for days. Demeter's grief over the stolen daughter was so great that plants stopped growing and the earth was threatened with great famine. Moss too suffers fiercely from the loss of his girl. And yet it is not clear at first whether she really exists, his daughter, or is a product of his imagination. Each new day, Moss is waiting for Amy's visit, and each new day, his hope of ever seeing her again is dashed. The real cause of the, let's call it the daughter neurosis, is Stella. She left Moss for another man in the 3rd year of their marriage, taking Amy, their young daughter, with her into the new relationship she has formed on the West Coast. Ultimately, Moss lost Amy in the divorce proceedings when he was stripped of custody at the instigation of the vindictive wife. Moss is thus much worse off than what is shown in the myth, where Zeus negotiated a deal with Hades so that Corey could spend 9 months of each year on Earth. For Moss McCloud, on the other hand, the loss of his girl is all-consuming. Moss's life problem is obviously grounded in his split from the anima, projected onto the woman and especially the daughter he idolizes. His story dramatizes the question of how a man can confront the difficult problem of the anima and find a relationship with his feminine side. We know the pattern from Goethe's Faust drama. Much like Faust, Moss does not know what the anima is. Like Faust, Moss has to go to the lowest hell to find out the secret. Throughout his life, he has only ever searched on the outside, and therefore has been unable to resolve the projection. Only when the narrator, who is also Moss's neighbor in Starlight Terrace, joins him in the search, does the knot begin to unravel. The inciting incident for this decisive turnaround is a second loss. One day, Moss discovers that the manuscript he has been writing for 20 years has been stolen from him. A manuscript he carries around with him in 2 folders like a fetish. It is an autobiographical account in which he tries to explain his failed marriage and at the same time tries to justify his own behavior. The intended recipient of this manuscript was the daughter. By it, she was to know that Moss had always loved her. The manuscript is basically a confession meant to replace for Amy the father she never had. But then Moss loses this manuscript. In a moment of unconsciousness, it is stolen from him. Stolen just like the daughter had been stolen from him. It is implied that he even suspects Stella of having stolen the manuscript from him, an absurd accusation that well reveals his projection. The woman is to him the wicked bitch who has messed up his life. In this situation of defeat and despair, the narrator enters the scene and offers his help to Moss. As the 2 of them comb through the trash dumpsters in the dark alley behind Ventura Boulevard, searching for the lost manuscript, Moss spontaneously begins to talk about Stella and her wicked deeds. He launches into a long monologue in which he gets all of his misfortune off his chest, this tremendous weight of his soul. What Moss doesn't yet know is the fact that his oral storytelling is actually already a recapturing, a recollection of what he has just lost. He does not suspect that it is his impassioned speech that brings the repressed events and feelings back to life before his eyes. Indeed, by the living recounting he gives, all those contents that had been split off for decades are reconnected to his consciousness. One may say that Patrick Roth uses his mouse figure to demonstrate the healing effect of oral narration directed at an interested listener. This is because the telling of one's own life story is always a gathering and a piecing together of events that happen to us seemingly arbitrarily, and therefore appear to be completely meaningless. But in this innocent, unintentional collecting and retelling of the fragments of one's own life, there is already the possibility of taking back the projection. If a listener is present, from whose reactions the person who is collecting can gain new insights. Oral storytelling thus amounts to a process anticipating the recollection of a projection. Because a listener is present, the narrated contents can come closer to consciousness, so that in the most favorable case, the projection can be dissolved. I think something along these lines is happening with Moss. When he remembers the events with Stella and gives them verbal expression, the memories and feelings associated with her come closer to consciousness. Which is why his image of Stella also begins to change during the narrative process. That is, during his act of telling his story. If at the beginning Stella was the woman without talents who cheated and stole from him, a despicable bitch, only concerned with her advantage, by the end of his search, she has transformed into the woman he deeply loved and cherished. From analytical work, we know resolution of the projection is a prerequisite for recovery the anima, as seen from the male point of view. So what happens in Moss as he descends, remembering and narrating, as he sinks into his personal unconscious? One could say a center begins to form, around which the shattered fragments of his life arrange themselves. At the end of his speech, Moss penetrates this initially unrecognizable center. Quote, "You are both here," unquote, he speaks at last, and, quote, "nothing is missing," unquote. With these words, Moss addresses his companion, the narrator, directly, speaking as though he were the finally found again Amy. Through narration, as a way of exposing or extracting psychic contents that are haunting and tormenting him, Moss has broken through to Stella, has recreated her in a remembering, gathering way. The fact that Moss addresses her directly proves her aliveness. He has resurrected her by the way of remembering and describing, and now in his mind's eye sees her before him. Therefore, one can speak of this ending as a classic anachnoresis. a typical scene of recognition. So anachnoresis means recognition. Mars's recognition implies eros, the relation function. This is reflected in his romantic description of the night of love with Stella. The feeling is reconnected. The feeling function is back. Viewed from the end of the story, it is the initially fatal loss of the written down and recorded life story that triggers Mars's search, his journey. Without this mishap, the narrator would not have intervened and nothing would have happened. From this, we see that behind the external events, there is, you could say, a mysterious power at work, subliminally guiding the hero's process. This hidden power is already evident in the opening scene, namely in Mars's request that the narrator walk out into the street and search for Amy. The narrator can't find her anywhere, and that makes him aware of the confused elderly gentleman that is Mars. The same power is behind the second purposeful encounter outside the appropriately named Borders bookstore that triggers Mars's great recollection and which ultimately leads him to the Anima. The same individuation dynamic is fueling the narrative rage that overtakes Mars and engages him in a long monologue, as furious as it is inspired, with countless embedded stories, digressions, and impressions, a monologue that ultimately leads him to healing. Literary scholars refer to the configuration we encounter in solar eclipse, namely of a narrator who tells a second separate story within a story, as an intradiegetic narrative situation. Intradiegetic, meaning the voice is inside the text. The physician and psychotherapist, on the other hand, would recognize this configuration as anamnesis. Anamnesis. This is Greek and means recollection. Jung used the term anamnesis in its original Platonic sense. When we acquire consciousness, knowledge, our learning is a recollection of prenatal knowledge. But this means all our cognition is nothing more than a recognition, a memory of what we once knew and now have forgotten. This archetypal theme is essential to Jungian analysis, which is just that, an intentional, orderly process of recollection that begins with the memory of the personal life and then delves deeper. Jung himself described the importance of anamnesis in his memoirs. Quote, "In many cases in psychiatry, the patient who comes to us has a story that is not told and which, as a rule, no one knows of. To my mind, therapy only really begins after the investigation of that whole personal story. It is the patient's secret, the rock against which he is shattered. If I know his secret story, I have a key to the treatment. The doctor's task is to find out how to gain that knowledge. In therapy, the problem is always the whole person, never the symptom alone. We must ask questions which challenge the whole personality. Unquote. The authenticity of a person, the core of his being, lies in the honestly told life story, which is why it is so valuable. At the same time, it contains Holy Scripture, insofar as the psyche has inscribed itself in it. It is Edinger. He puts it this way, quote, "Every careful analysis starts with a detailed history of the patient. I think of such a beginning as the reading of the scriptures of that person's life. So I study an individual's history the same way I study the books of the Old Testament. I always try to be on the lookout for evidence of a transpersonal purpose in an individual's life story." Unquote. The traces of the self are found in the emotionally charged situations of a life. I think this is so important that I repeat it. The traces of the self, so you could say the traces of God, are found in the emotionally charged situations of a life. The therapeutic conversation is about finding these sensitive places marked by affect and giving them narrative expression. Moss's account maps the emotions well. The hatred for Stella is evident, as is the revenge-driven criminal plot to get back his daughter. Also the feelings of shock and horror before the dark god and the bank window, you remember, which cause him to back away. Or the sudden affection he feels for Stella. All these strong feelings are signatures of the self, which have touched him here, have intervened here. It is no accident that Moss's story consists almost entirely of a dialogue between the protagonist and the narrator. However, the dialogue structure, which still comprises 2/3 of the narrative's total length, is not visible on the surface of the text, because the narrator's questions and comments have been almost entirely removed in order to focus on Moss's character, who, aided by the patient listener, is working himself out of his darkness, as it were. By remembering and telling his personal story in the presence of the narrator, who is also neighbor through the shadow, that is, Moss is in a sense heals himself. One can, if one wishes, see solar eclipse as a tribute to the healing power of storytelling. At the same time, it is a story in which the female element is missing. The female element appears only as seen through the lens of the male and remains entirely in the background of the plot. The absence of the feminine indicates the necessary task of integrating it. It is therefore no coincidence that the Moss story begins with the search for the daughter and deals with the approach to the anima, how to come closer to it. Okay, now I proceed to my next chapter, and this is the Anima Problem. Moss embodies the prototype of the abandoned man who is torn out of his quiet life path by his wife's adultery and is thus confronted with the Anima Problem. Doubts are awakened and his previous views and convictions break down. The infidelity of the woman on the outside in real life is compounded by the inner situation of midlife, which per se demands a fundamental transformation of consciousness. As we know, the anima represents the soul image of the man, his feminine side, which is compensatory to the conscious attitude. This feminine side acts as a bridge to the deep-seated sensual wholeness of his personality. Marie-Louise von Franz describes it this way, quote, "As we know, the feminine side of the unconscious in a man mediates the relationship to the deep-seated, meaningful wholeness of his personality. If a man heeds this element of feeling, which is also involved in his relationships with women, rather than rejecting it as nonsense, he can only cause it to be more favorably disposed toward him. In this way, he becomes inspired and acquires wings in reaching his goals." Unquote. Moss has so far disregarded or outsourced his emotional side to the woman, his wife and his daughter. As long as the anima is unconscious, and it usually remains so until the second half of life, it is experienced exclusively in projection. The conflict with Stella has thrown Moss back on himself. In such a situation, it is right to turn inward and establish a relationship with the unconscious. In this way, the anima may become conscious as an inner factor. In his Children's Dream seminar, Jung describes what happens in the process of integrating the anima. Quote, "The result of the animas becoming conscious is that distinctions are being made. The paradoxical and, as it were, completely amoral anima has to be split, because otherwise it would remain inexplicable and not comprehensible for consciousness. Then it occurs that the man experiences the white and the black anima, the saint and the witch, or the evil Circe. The anima is an absolutely paradoxical being, which, however, is basically always one and the same. It is precisely her ambiguous nature that fascinates man, attracts him until he perishes, and that he has to escape." Unquote. The splitting of the anima occurs unconsciously in Moss, It simply happens, triggered by the woman's repulsion as she abandons and leaves him. The rupture in their relationship, as the narrative suggests, results primarily from the problematic relationship Mars maintains with his daughter. The crucial clue here is provided by the arrangement of two photographs of children that Mars has arranged in his little hideaway, a shelter within his apartment he refers to as his Ark of Bulrushes. In German, Binsenkästchen. The Ark of Bulrushes, the ark or vessel in which the baby Moses is abandoned on the Nile. This is in Exodus 2:3. Mars has arranged these photos in his Ark of Bulrushes so they hang opposite each other, as if they were engaged in a dialogue with one another. One shows Amy, the other Mars himself, both at the age of 3. Amy is holding up to the camera a drawing she dedicated to her father, a blue winged horse, a Pegasus. Mars's picture on the other side of the bedside table is captioned "Miracle Boy." The old newspaper clipping shows a boy with a thickly bandaged head. This image documents an early trauma in Mars's life, an attempted murder, possibly committed by his own mother, who he believes threw her son out of a window in a fit of rage. Mars barely survived that initial assault. Although his personal mother resembled a cold, uncaring stepmother, in German we say a raven mother, eine Rabenmutter to him, although she resembled this cold, uncaring stepmother, Mars is too attached to the mother image. As a father, he tries to make up for the negativity of his mothering experience by being the good mother to his own child, or by making the daughter his mother. The most violent anima obsession can develop from such a constellation as Jung explains. This is again a quote from the Children's Dream Seminar, quote, "The more somebody clings to the mother, the more dependent he is on the processes going on in his unconscious. The stronger their archetypal power and their demonic power will become," unquote. This fate of a pronounced mother complex is alluded to by the Pegasus, which the daughter holds up to the father as if it were a sign. The Pegasus, a hybrid of bird and horse, is a child of the Gorgon Medusa and an emblem of the creative or generating power. Where its hoof stamps, a spring gushes forth. The winged horse has been the symbol of poets since the Renaissance. Another episode of the Pegasus myth relevant for our context tells of the ancient hero Bellerophon, who succeeded in taming the wild Pegasus, so that with its help, he could defeat the Chimera, a mother dragon with 3 heads. Because Mars develops a mad monkey love for Amy and oversteps the boundaries of his care, Stella tries to destroy their relationship. The extent to which Mars idealizes and appropriates his daughter can further be seen in the fact that even as an older man, he constantly lives with expectation of her arrival, in a sense, fantasizing her into his presence. One could say Mars's anima image here is too high and too pure. It does not want to mix with the dark side of the woman. Here is also the deeper reason why Stella was cruel to him and pursued separation. Before the judge, before the court, she presents his monkey love as pedophilia, one of the sharpest weapons to deprive him of custody. It's as if she were telling him, you are completely identified with your daughter. This has to end. The divorce seems negative, but it actually means something positive. Only through the external separation does Mars have a chance to get away from his anima obsession. If it had not happened in this way, he wouldn't have developed his personality nor his creative potential. Jung has described the necessity of dissolving the man's anima projection. Quote from the children's seminars, dream seminars. The first anima experience of the boy is a very high idea, something incomprehensibly grand and beautiful. It is so beautiful that he just knows that he can only lose it. It is like the farewell to paradise, that wonderful thing, just beginning, filled with pain, it's lost. This is connected with those golden memories, those prenatal images, which are still sensed by the child. The boy's separation pain shows that he is attached to those magical images, that he comes from that world, which, however, he has to leave behind. He has to choose the dirty path, just as eating dust comes after the loss of paradise. It is outright dangerous to remain attached to this lost world, because in that case, one refuses to get in touch with the earth. And that means one will never quite be born into life, unquote. Stella, which means Latin star, Stella then would literally become a faded star guiding Mars's life for good or ill. This path of conflict proceeds in stages. It begins with the splitting of the anima image. Stella is the witch who takes what is dearest to him. Amy, on the other hand, is Mars's greatest treasure. Mars is thereby suspended between the light anima aspect in the daughter and the dark anima aspect in the woman, the wife. For a man suffering from a mother complex, it is a great challenge to accept the abysmal, ugly, or even treacherous female as he experiences her embodiment in the unfaithful, retaliation-seeking woman that Stella is. Such a man fears the dark side of the feminine. It could devour him, and attempts to suppress it. Because Stella now robs him of the highest value in life, a deadly blow to him, Mars is thrown into grim conflict. No doubt, because the earlier trauma of the negative mother is touched upon once more, he forgets himself. Diabolical passions seize him. Anger, hatred, and possessiveness lead him to get involved with a sinister force like the mafia to get his child back. To commission his own wife, that is to allow for someone, some dark figure, to put a murder contract out on Stella, seems to Mars the only conceivable solution to his problem. This is only possible because he is completely disconnected from feeling. Once again, and I'm coming to the end of my first part of the presentation, once again, a brief summary. The initial situation of the story shows a split between the female and the male principal. They are out of relation. The woman becomes unfaithful and wants a divorce. The man makes his demands and pursues the woman relentlessly. This personal problem corresponds to a collective state of consciousness in which the male principle, spirit, exhausts itself in conflict situations, while the female principle of eros, the culture of feeling and mediation, has degenerated and is only interested in matters of prestige and power. Amy, the daughter, symbolizes a possibility for renewal of the feminine energy that would have to assert itself in the face of these difficulties. However, the feminine remains absent in this narrative in Solar Eclipse. Later on, June, the woman in the Sea of Stars, in the fourth narrative, takes her place. Okay, that's the first part of my presentation.